It began out on the dual carriageway. One summer's evening there was Kerry and Mark and myself. And Mark, discussing running books, as runners tend to do, said, "Barefoot running, that's supposed to be very good for you." And I said, "In a field on the beach." He said, no, there are people doing it just generally. Apparently it's really good for you. And I remember looking down at the assortment of concrete that was passing beneath my feet along the dual carriageway and thinking, none of this is particularly attractive. I have no overwhelming desire now to take off my trainers and socks and run along this. And as we chatted about it, it transpired that he had read a book called Born to Run by an author called Christopher McDougall. Now, if you only have the vaguest interest in sports books or running books, then read it. Very engaging, very funny at times. And he begins his story contemplating his own knee pain, having reached his early 40s and been a runner all his life and not been able to run much further. And he got tired of going to the doctor and getting stuck in this vicious circle of getting to his GP and saying, "Doctor, my knees are sore." And his doctor would say, "Yes, running is bad for you." And he'd say, "But why is it bad for me?" And his doctor would say, "Because it makes your knees sore." So he wanted to break out of that, and he addresses the question, what is it that is fundamentally wrong with human beings? Why can't we put one foot in front of the other at speed and not have bits of us break? We seem to be the only animal that actually does this. Giraffes do not need to apply ice packs to their knees. Wolves do not pull up with shin splints. So what is fundamentally wrong with human beings? Well, we can't rule out concrete. Concrete's a fairly recent development. We know that it's pretty hard on the system, and there is that. But let's set concrete aside just for a moment. Because one of the things that Christopher McDougall began to look at was trainers and the history of training shoes. And I want to make two comments about them tonight that both he and others have made. The first is that when you stick a huge rubber or sort of plastic sole to your foot, it immediately changes the way that you run. Most people, when they're in trainers, heel strike. They run onto the heel, usually with a locked leg, into the midfoot, and then they push off onto the next foot and bounce between the two. Now, when that happens, it's frequently with a locked leg, and when you see that in slow motion, the heel strike causes a shock wave to ripple up the leg, which can't be particularly good for you. And the second thing that it does is that it adds length to us. It adds another inch to us. It allows us to bounce along the ground. It also lengthens our stride, which means that we stretch more things are taut, and then things tear and break more easily. Now, when you take trainers off, two things happen. When I take trainers off, three things happen, but we're going to eat shortly, so we'll deal with two of them. The two things that happen when you take your trainers off is that you have to run differently. Heel striking doesn't occur anymore. It's just too sore. You can't do that. And if you've ever run along a beach or even just run around a field somewhere, you'll notice that you tend to land on the ball of your foot more. So when you barefoot run, you step onto the ball of your foot, you touch down with your heel, at which point you transfer your weight to the other foot. You tend not to bounce as you do with trainers. This means that the shock wave that you get that ripples back up the locked leg doesn't happen. The second thing is that to do that effectively, you need a little bit of bend in your ankles and a lot more bend in your knees. And so the impact of running is absorbed by that little concertina movement. And of course, you're not bouncing from foot to foot. You're stepping from foot to foot. So you've got to start thinking about running very differently. You've got to change your terminology. Heel strikes don't happen. Pavement pounding doesn't happen. It's a whole new thing going on out there. Now, I feel that before I take you any further, inevitably people have two objections to this. So I'm going to put this to the test by show of hands. Firstly, how many people are concerned about broken glass? Half the heading for more than half the audience. Right, okay. Well, I've never been cut yet. Nobody I know has ever been cut yet, and I've yet to read a blog or a book about it. Now, that either means that people are covering up their lacerated feet, or this genuinely doesn't seem to be a problem. And I suspect it probably isn't an issue. I don't think it's impossible. I think if you want to run around on lots of broken glass a lot, you probably will get cut. But when you step down and lift that foot, I think it is actually possible to run on jagged edges and not cut yourself. Now, if you stand on a very big stone on tarmac, you will yelp. There really isn't any way around that. You try to avoid those if at all possible. Gravel is doable. Big stone, not so much. The second thing, again, just show of hands, if this has been circulating in your thoughts, dog crap. Slightly less, but still a significant number. And I think that possibly says more about some of you than it does about me. Again, it's kind of like walking. The principle's the same. Look where you're going, go right, and if all else fails, wash it off. That's pretty much all I've got on that one. Having dealt with those two, a friend of mine who's a GP made two interesting comments. He's a GP, so I do tend to listen to him more than the other wingnuts that I know. So he made two comments. One is that when he was in the Himalayas, he was doing a bit of climbing, and at the lower levels, a lot of their gear was carried by Sherpas, who were all barefoot. And he said he could not get over the musculature on the soles of the feet. Where there was a need for muscles to develop, muscles develop. And similarly, he would say in his surgery, which is a little bit outside Belfast, that you can always tell the hands of children and adults who work on farms. He would say their hands, the musculature, again, so much more developed because they're used so much more. Where there's a need, muscles develop. He would say to, it's interesting if we look at our reaction. Since our children can walk, we say they need shoes, and we put them in shoes, so we stop the muscles developing. And it would be interesting to figure out what would happen if we took the hands of children. The minute they start picking stuff up, we put them in big, thick plastic gloves to protect their wee hands. Of course, muscles wouldn't develop the same way. Now, he adds one other rider to that, and I'll return to this later on. That is that, can you get muscles to develop if they haven't been there before? Sherpas, I'm guessing in the Himalayas, have been doing it for a long time, running about barefoot for a long time. So my question was, could a 38-year-old bloke be able to develop those muscles? I add that I'm not 38 anymore, but I was when I started this whole thing. So could you develop the muscles, or would you end up just hurting yourself? Well, I took a lot of advice, read books, read blogs, got a bit obsessed about it. Like 38-year-old blokes do. And I built it up slowly. We have a treadmill at home that nobody ever seemed to want, so it finished up as a feature in our dining room. So I began on the treadmill, running every other day, no more than 3 times a week, half a mile, just building that up very, very gently. And at the end of 2 months, I decided it was time to take this outside. Big step. So I think it was about May. It was a relatively warm morning, although the ground was wet. And I remember 7:15, standing at our front door, barefooted, wearing 2 items of clothing. That's shorts and a shirt, in case you have a vivid imagination. It's not like a hat and a scarf. There's a whole other thing. So standing there, and I will admit, there is a point where you stand with your hand on the handle and think, am I being a dick? There's a point you just got to get over that and go with it. And I was only going out for 5 or 6 minutes. I wasn't going to go too far and just build things up very gently. And 2 things happened. The first 2 or 3 minutes was a sense of confusion. There's a lot of nerve ends on the soles of the feet. Apparently, I am told, there's more nerve ends in the soles of the feet than there are in the hand. And they go into overdrive. So there is 2 or 3 minutes of sheer panic. Whatever office in the brain the nerve ends connect to, it doesn't do much up there. The office workers sit about all day reading newspapers, drinking coffee, eating a Danish. Nothing happens in there. And then there was this overload of information coming from the soles of my feet. Once that moment of, do I not like this, I think is the phrase of one England manager. Once that subsides, there's a definite feeling of elation, which I really, really liked and got to enjoy going out again just 2 or 3 times a week. In fact, so much so that on the nights when I would go out barefoot running just 5 or 6 minutes, maybe getting up to 8, 9, 10 minutes and moving beyond that, the nights where I wanted to do a longer run, I was meeting somebody else for a run, where I would come back to the house and put on the shoes, it kind of felt like I was leaving the house in clown feet again. There was something that just felt intrinsically wrong with that. Reaction to from the good people of Four Winds was, Interesting, there were people who just would notice me from a distance and then refused to look at me or anywhere near me. There were people who wanted to look at me without actually letting on that they were looking at me. Then there would be people who just couldn't help themselves and would just stand and gawk at you. A car drove past me one night and the bloke actually stopped, rolled down his window and went, "You've got no shoes on!" And I'm thinking, you've got no filter. Let's compare things neither of us have. That aside, I really like barefoot running for one main reason. And that is I've quite thick calf muscles. It's a sort of genetic thing. But I don't warm up terribly easy. It takes me, 10, 20 minutes sometimes to get through the whole, clearing out acid, warming up, just that whole thing. I find running, if I set off too quickly, it gets quite painful. And I frequently set off too quickly because I live at the top of the Four Winds, so inevitably you've got to run downhill and then discover that after 10 minutes you can't run very fast. And with barefoot running, I would run more slowly and warm up more gently. And also, the stopwatch stayed at home. I wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. I was just beginning to enjoy it. And it kind of changed the way I approached running after that. I wasn't thinking about time anymore. So the whole warming up thing became a lot easier. So I decided to apply this to climbing Clonard. I quite like fell running. Now, I don't run up Clonard. There are people who do, and I'm not one of them. I kind of walk up there quickly. But I thought, well, would that help? Because any time I've climbed Clonard as quickly as I can, I tend to lock up. If you know sort of Newcastle at all, once you get out of the back of Clonard Park, by that point my legs have just become sort of, it's like walking through treacle. Just can't go any faster until the muscles get warmed up. And I thought, well, would this work? And it worked splendidly until the cold got the better of me, because I decided to try this in late March, and by the time I got to the Black Stairs, which isn't even halfway up, it was socks and shoes came back out of the bum bag. It just wasn't working because I was numb by that point. But I had enjoyed it, and I had noticed that mud sticks a lot less to skin than it does to trainers, so there's a definite moment of travelling lighter. And I came back about 3 weeks later and managed to get to the top of Clonard barefoot, no problem at all. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and only about 2 minutes slower than I would normally have done in proper footwear. Now, coming down is a bit of a problem, because coming down you change, you're kind of rubbing on the ground a lot more as the ground slopes away from you, and you're hitting gravel, and I'm afraid there may be people who have a better system than me. It didn't really work for me at all. I'm not doctrinaire about these things, so the shoes went on very quickly. I need to wind up, but here's my thought. That wasn't timed, that just happened. But I was so impressed for a split second. I think they can hear me think that in my head. In this age, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. Because I just like the freedom of it. I don't think I'm ever going to be very good at it. There is a group of barefoot runners, and I have to say, I feel slightly embarrassed doing this talk. I'm not one of them, because there's a group of runners in Belfast at the moment, two of whom finished the Belfast half marathon. Barefoot about a month ago. And it is only a matter of time before one of them, or one of that small group, finishes the Belfast full marathon in May. It's coming. I'm not sure I'm ever going to get there. I don't think I've ever really got past about the 3 mile point. And I have injured myself now and again. Once it couldn't work out if it was the barefoot running or a change in footwear, but I just had to stop at that point for 2 or 3 months. So it hasn't always been plain sailing. It would be wrong to say that. But I like the freedom of it. And in an age where the words leisure industry no longer seem to be an oxymoron, we're kind of fine with this idea of paying huge amounts to buildings to give us weird machines to muck about on, and really well-toned, pretty people to make out personal programs as to how we should circulate round the weird machines. Apologies to anybody that I've just offended in that whole industry. But it's more complicated than it needs to be. It seems to be that we need to manage our leisure. There's an industry out there that says that leisure's not just for sitting about. You've got to work at it. Here's a book of 1,000 places to visit before you die, or 1,000 albums to listen to before you die, 1,000 films to watch. Pack it all in, because, you got leisure. You've got to take it seriously. And against what's out there, I quite like the simplicity of heading out the door in those 2 articles of clothing, with the ground beneath your feet, no sense of a stopwatch, And perhaps the best things in life are actually that simple and that uncomplicated, and that might be an idea worth thinking about. Thank you.